Welcome back. This is lesson 3 of how to make a website, part of our Lifehacker Night School series on, you guessed it, how to make a website. It's HTML and CSS that we're covering all week, and we're going to take you today through the process of making a website from start to finish. Now, we've already covered actually putting a design together in Photoshop, and you'll find a link in the notes of this lesson that will direct you to that, so you can actually learn how to design a website technically in Photoshop if you'd like to do so. Today we're going to be starting from an actual design, and this is just going to be something really basic so we can see how to transform what you're looking at on your screen right now into HTML and CSS. Now, there are a couple things in the design phase that you do want to pay attention to, and that is fonts and images. You need to realize which parts of your design are actually images and need to be images, and you need to realize which fonts you're using and what trouble that may cause you. Now, in this, I've used only Arial, because Arial is a web-safe font, and there are other web-safe fonts like Times New Roman, Georgia, Tahoma, Trebuchet, MS. For example, there's a longer list and means of finding more in the notes for this lesson, but basically you have your main fonts are Times New Roman and Arial. I've done this whole thing in Arial, so I know that when I go in and add fonts to my CSS and say this is the font face I want to use, then it will show up exactly or pretty close to how I have designed it in Photoshop. Now, if you want to use other fonts that are not web safe, you can do that using the @font-face CSS rule. There's more information about that in the notes. And that will let you use pretty much any font you want by serving it up from a web server, your web server, someone else's web server, wherever. Now, that's a little bit more advanced and takes a little bit of extra work. We're not going to get into that here, but it is an option to you if you're bored with web-safe fonts. Now, the other thing you have to pay attention to is what's actually an image. And you'll notice in this design there's really not anything that's an image. This is text, this is text. Even this rounded rectangle with the shadow, we can do that in CSS. So this is pretty much all text. The only thing that's actually an image is the background. So we need to save that background out as an actual image file. Now, the one that I have pasted in here, as you can see if I move it around, it's a bit bigger than you're actually looking at in the mockup. So we want to take a look at saving that file out. Now, I have that hidden somewhere in here. There it is. Get rid of that. And this is the full background image file, and it's pretty big. So when you save images out for the web in Photoshop, you need to go ahead and choose Save for Web and Devices. Now, if you're using something else, it'll have a similar thing, but the main thing you want to pay attention to when saving images for the web is whether or not to make it a JPEG or a PNG file, and in most cases you'll want to make it a 24-bit PNG file. So I'm saving for web, and you'll see I already have PNG 24 selected, and it's going to be about 58K, which is a pretty decent size considering it's our only image on the page right now. And I'm going to bet that JPEG is probably going to be a bit higher. Nope, it's the same. So a lot of the times, the reason I thought that the JPEG would be higher is because JPEG basically compresses the information that it gets from an image pretty equally. And so it's good for really complex images because it will compress them as it sees them, and it will throw out data it doesn't need. If you have a very simple graphic like this one, which is only a few colors and there's no tonal changes really, and it's and that's it, or you just have or you have maybe a black and white graphic, or if you have a graphic with a transparent background, which we'll talk about that in a minute, then you want to use PNG. And so PNG is often going to be a larger file size because the compression isn't lossy really, and that's great if you want full quality, but it can make for some really bad load times in your web browser if you're using lots and lots of PNGs. So this one we want to save as a PNG because there's really no disadvantage. The size is pretty much the same as it is as a JPEG. In fact, I think the JPEG is the JPEG a little bit 0.1 and 0.7 No, it's about, the ping's actually probably a little bit bigger there. So we'll save that out, and you just save it, and you name the file whatever you want, and as you can see, we'll talk about this organization more in a minute. I'm going to save it to my image folder, and I'm going to call it background.ping. Save it, Photoshop saves it out, and we're done. So I can close out of that. Now let's say this background, we did want that to be an image. So I'm going to, if you're saving backgrounds out in Photoshop, you need to get rid of all the other elements that you don't want. So even the background layer. So you can see the background. And then you can go ahead and choose Select All, which would be under the Select menu. And if you copy that, I'm going to copy merged layers. I'm going to make a new document and paste that in. Then it's cropped to the exact size. So there are a lot of ways to do that, but this is one way that I like to do. I'm going to remove the background again, so there's that transparency, and then I'm going to choose Save for Web. And you'll see that that transparency is gone. That is because, or I'm sorry, the background's gone. And that's because I have transparency checked. If I uncheck that, up comes the white background. And you can see this increases the file size because it has to have that extra information to say, yes, I want that transparent background. But that will let you overlay an image on, say, a complex background like the one that we just exported. And by complex, I mean more than just one color. So that way you can change the background color and still have those images apply nicely. It makes it a lot easier to manipulate your designs and make quick changes like that, like changing out the backgrounds while not having to resave all of your images with a new background color. So that's how you would save that out if we wanted it to be an image, but we can do that with CSS, so we're not going to. So that's basically how you get your images out of Photoshop or whatever you're using and get it ready for the web. The other thing we want to do in preparation is take a measurement. We need to know how big everything is. Now the width, we know that our background is 1920 pixels wide because we saw that when we saved it out as an image. So that's how much width we actually have for the background. What we really need to know is how big this thing is. How big is this panel here? So there are a lot of ways you can measure it. If you just copy this information here, if you copy merged and make a new document, you'll see it'll say that's 946 pixels wide. So that's how wide it is, and that's what we need to know. If you have multiple columns, you want to measure the first column, the second column, also the spacing in between those two columns, and so you have those three measurements plus the entire width, because you're going to need that when laying out your website in CSS. So now that we have that information, there's actually one real more thing we need to do, and that is organize everything nicely in folders. Now you see I have 4 folders here. I have one for PSD, which is just where I'm storing the mockups. That doesn't need to get uploaded to our website when we're all done. So I put an underscore in front of it just so I know to ignore that. That's not going to tell any software to ignore it, but that's just how I indicate that to myself. It puts everything with an underscore up at top that way. Next, we have CSS. Some people like to call this folder style sheets. And you can put your CSS style sheets that are not part of your actual HTML documents into CSS. So if you're using external CSS style sheets, it's good to have them in their own folder. Images, we only have one image, so we probably don't need an images folder to organize them all, but chances are you're going to have more than one image on your website. So if you do, then you can use the images folder to store them all so they're all in one convenient location. We're going to skip over this for a second and go right to scripts. And this is not something we're going to deal with today, but let's say you were using JavaScript in your website. You can store all your JavaScript files in here to keep them organized. So that way, when we close all this stuff up, the only thing you're going to see is your folders and your HTML documents. And that makes it much easier to find the pages that you want to edit and keep everything else organized in their own isolated places. So now we have one file here, and this is completely empty. I have this in TextMate. I'll show you. This is an empty index.html file, and what we haven't talked about yet is why it's called index.html. Index.html is basically a pointer that says when you go to a directory on a website, this is the default page to load. So if I go to mywebsite.com and I have this index.html file in the root directory of my website, then it will load index.html. If I had it named something like wallpaper.html, which is not index.html obviously, then it won't load that. Instead, some servers will load a listing of the directory so people can start browsing through your files, which you don't necessarily want, or it will load a blank page. It depends on how your web server is set up, but basically you don't want to be without an index.html page in each directory of your website. You may even want to put them in images, CSS, and scripts, so when people go to those directories, if they went to mywebsite.com/scripts, then they wouldn't get a listing of your scripts, but rather an index.html page. And that can have nothing on it, then that will load a blank page and prevent a directory listing, which is probably what you want in that instance. But when you're actually making a website, you want to use index.html as your default home page. And you can have other HTML files that are linked from that page on index.html or on any other page really. But index is the one that's going to be the default when people come to your site. Okay, so now we have everything organized and we need to develop the site based on our layout. We're going to use the CSS and HTML skills we learned in the previous 2 lessons, plus anything else we picked up on our own, to put this together. Now, this is just a demo website, and so actually going through every single step of this would, 1, take a long time, and 2, not necessarily be terribly useful to you because it's not the website you're actually making. So what we're going to do is code this up and then talk about a few interesting and helpful things that have come along in the process so you can learn more about handy CSS tips and also how to properly put together a website. We've been looking at the easy way to form an HTML page, but there are some things that you'll want to know that are handy in both HTML and CSS. So give me a minute, I'm going to write the code for this website and we'll be right back. Okay, the code's all done, and as you can see here, this is a lot more than we had before. In fact, these are just blocks of text from the lesson, from our lesson notes, and this is the design section. Now, I've also added a lot of HTML and divs to specify where things go, and you can also see there's a whole bunch of CSS. I've made a file called styles.css, which is now in our CSS folder, and it is linked to in our HTML document, in our index.html document here. So let's take a look at what this code looks like in a web browser. So there's our site. As you can see, these are not active, but actual links. This is our header. This is our text here, and this is all rendered with just one image, and that's this background image. You can see when I go like that, it moves around. So let's take a look at what's going on in the code. Let's see our CSS here. Now, we're not going to get into this in a huge amount of detail because you'll be able to download this code and look it over and see, what's going on for yourself and adjust things. And I highly recommend doing this, downloading it and playing around with it so you can see what making changes does. Now, as you can see here, I have our header set to 62 pixels because that's how big it is. Now you'll notice that I also have a line height of 14. That's because if I don't specify a line height, save that, reload, there's this big space here. So specifying a line height of 14 brings that in a bit. That's the same thing that's going on here. This is text. This is not an image. And that is part of our site title section. You can see what I did here is I specified a line height of 15 because if I don't specify that, it's floating above the div, the page layout here, and that's not how we specified it when we were making our design. So I'm setting that back to 15, and there we go. Now another thing you can do to take care of that is not use line height but use negative margins, and as you can see that also changed it. Now you might be wondering what's going on here with the margins. This is, you can specify margins by going margin left equals 10 pixels, and margins are how far it's being pushed in from the left side, pushed in from the right side, etc. by default relative to where it's positioned on the page. So relative to its containing element, which in this case is a div called page. But you can specify all of those things at once right here. And you do that by in the order of top, right, bottom, and left. So that's T, R, B, L. And I remember that because it's kind of looks like trouble when you spell it out like that. So that's how you can specify your margins really easily. What else are we doing here? We're using span classes to specify these colors. As you can see, I have classes for each one of these colors, 1, 2, 3, 4, for our numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And if you look here, they're not linked to, but they're set. So if I were to set any of this other text, as we learned yesterday, to one of these classes, it would change the color of the class. So this one, if I set any other text to that class, it would be reddish, and this would be yellow, and green, and blue, and so on. I've also set global properties for the body, and this just applies to anything on the document unless it's overridden by other CSS code in the style sheet. And you can see I set the default font to Arial, which is a web-safe font, but then I've also set alternatives of Helvetica and Helvetica New by just listing them in order and separating them by commas. I've set the font size, the color of the font, which 333 is gray. Now 333 really stands for 333, 333, but because the second half of that number is identical, we only have to put the first three, just like FFF would be white, but that's not very useful. So we'll set it back to what it was. So as you can see, that's basically what's going on here. One more thing I want to take a look at is the rounded corners and the drop shadow, because this is a more advanced thing that you may want to play with. And it's really not all that hard to do. So as you can see here, I put in little comments, which are designated by a slash and a star, and then ended with a star and a slash. And as you can see here, I've set border radius to 24 pixels, 24 pixels, and I've also specified a specific CSS rule for WebKit and Mozilla browsers, which it's basically the same thing, but these are their options, so that makes sure that you have full compatibility in all your browsers. I did the same thing for the drop shadow, and this is specifying the horizontal and vertical offset of the shadow, which is none, because it's just dropping directly off. This is the blur radius, so how big that drop shadow blur is, and then this is the color of the shadow. And so that's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. Obviously we could just go like that too, but that's black. So that's how you do rounded corners and drop shadow. Now all we have to do now is upload our website online, and then it will be done. Uploading is really easy if you already have a web server set up. And if you don't, that's okay. We're going to be talking about getting a web host tomorrow and how to set it all up and deploy everything. But we're going to take a really quick peek at it right now. So when you're connecting, you're generally going to connect with FTP or SFTP, which is just secure FTP. And then you'll need to connect to a server. When you sign up for a web host, you'll know what that server is. Mine is toasterdog.com. You're going to type in your new username. You're going to type in your password. I believe that's mine. And you're also going to type in a path to the file, to the directory that you want to go to. And then you'll enter a port if it's not the default port of 21, and the type of FTP protocol you're going to use. This is with a secure socket layer, so that's you'll know what to connect to based on what your web host tells you. If they offer security, you generally want to take them up on that, but SFTP will do the job. We're going to connect in securely right now. So that's going to bring me into all of this stuff here. I'm going to make a new folder called My Website, and I am going to copy all these files, just drag them in, and have them upload to the server. now my website has been deployed. So when I go to toasterdog.com/my website, you'll see that's the same page we were just working on. So it's that easy to deploy your site online by just uploading it. And it gets more complicated when you're doing complex web applications with server-side languages like PHP, for example. But since we're just using HTML, it works all the same on your desktop as it does online. You just have to upload it. So we'll be talking tomorrow about how to get a web host and how to upload all that stuff and actually deploy your site for real. So stay tuned for that. But for now, you've just finished creating a website from start to finish.